Hello, welcome back to Armchair Artist. Apologies if you can hear traffic. I am currently in my bedroom editing this, and I realised that I forgot to introduce today's guest, and that would be doing a disservice. So today's chat is with Susan Matthews. Susan is a PhD candidate. She operates a independent record label. She is constantly collaborating with other artists and organisations, and she just has a really interesting sound art practice. She was great to talk to, always a good time, so professional, just great person, great chat. So yeah, enjoy. So the reason I thought that you'd be really good to talk to is because what you're working on is really something that's highly embodied and touches on themes of kind of non-place, and you're drawing on personal experience, which is something that I'm doing as well. So I think there's a kind of natural reciprocity maybe, or symbiosis kind of between what we're working on at the moment. So I wondered if you would talk a little bit about what you're currently up to.
Okay, yes, I agree. What I'm doing does have an autoethnographic approach, definitely using that as a methodology. What I've been looking at is an experience of serious illness, of breast cancer, and the impact that that has on both the physical body and the psyche, and the visual scars that it leaves behind and the visual difference to the body. And I agree, I think this is where there is some overlap in our work. I have a sense that we're both working on trying to process something that has happened to us. In creative ways. I think we're both using creative methodologies to explore that, albeit in very different ways. So my approach has been, what I found after my experience was I felt extremely uncomfortable about my body and very confused about what had happened to me. But I also felt very traumatized. And I was aware that as a person who lived with PTSD for many years, and ironically went through a very intensive therapy process, structured therapy, to overcome decades of PTSD. I'd literally just finished it as I was diagnosed with breast cancer.
Gosh.
Which left me feeling extremely angry. But also worried because I knew that I was vulnerable to relapse. So to move my creative practice into that area was a way, on a very personal level and a very constructive level, of me attempting to avoid relapsing back into PTSD. But I knew I had to be really careful in the way that I approached it, because I think it's quite easy for one to re-traumatize oneself over and over again. And I'm also not of the opinion that making work about difficult things we go through is necessarily cathartic. I don't think it's enough to heal deep-seated trauma. If it was, I don't think I would have developed PTSD in the first place. I think that's, for me, I needed a structured therapy. And this time around with the breast cancer experience, I realized I needed to take a very structured approach and be very careful. What I found was I began by visually documenting the scar. So right from the day of surgery, I photographed it every day for a number of months, or most days for a number of months, so that because I knew that in the long run that would give me lots of material that I could look back on and utilize creatively later on. And I didn't know what form that would take, but I used that as a starting point. And the way I approached it initially was looking at the whole body and thinking about the impact it had on me. But what I found after a few months of that was that it felt almost too subjective, that it was just all, this is my body, this is what I've been through. Yes. It felt a bit on the nose, and it didn't feel like it was doing the job that I wanted it to do, because I wanted to create work, but I didn't want it to be from the perspective of an audience looking at it. I was really aware I didn't want it to feel self-absorbed, or I didn't want to distract from the fact that it was about this specific thing that had happened.
I have a really similar thing in my own work of getting the tone right and getting the positioning the work in a space where there's some distance between kind of what's happened to you and you now analysing it. And I think in order to process your own experience to make work from it, you have to have that kind of degree of objectivity. But it's interesting because somebody recently, another artist recently said to me that I should try and put more of me into the work, aka sort of do what you say not to do, which is to make it a bit more on the nose. So there's kind of interesting their point of view as quite a prolific artist. I won't say who they are, but and their experience. I wonder if, to what degree people need like relatability, maybe, or perhaps the real question is, as somebody who's doing their PhD, doing your PhD is kind of what's like the sweet spot of positioning your work between very institutional, academic, and then really like highly accessible, a kind of, I don't know, non-academic, very literal, but still good as art. If that even made sense as a question.
Yeah, that's quite a tough one, isn't it? Because coming back to what you were saying about the person approaching you in that way, I guess in that instance, it's about what the art is for. And for me personally, I knew that the art was more about me exploring a concept and an idea and exploring an experience than it was about trying to communicate that experience directly. That I was very careful early on when I started on the MA course. What I tried to do was keep myself distant. So I talked about it as this is an exploration of breast cancer. And I kept myself in the background. Yeah. But inevitably people guessed that it was me. And so for me, it was tricky to... I think there was a part of me that was trying to protect myself. But also, I'm very interested in that idea of almost pushing my ego. And as a musician, obviously, I do performances, and I'm quite interested in that, pushing the performer to the back, but the art to the front.
Wow, yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah. And that's just where I'm at this point in my life. I like that idea of being, because I'm quite a shy person naturally, so I quite like the idea of myself in the background. And the art was more important to me than... And I don't mind. I don't have an issue if people don't understand what my work is about. And I don't have an issue if people don't like my work, as long as I feel that it's communicating what I want and need and intend it to communicate.
Yeah.
And inevitably, people process things in different ways, yes. And no amount of explaining things to everybody is going to lead to people understanding it anyway. Yeah. So I don't spend too much time worrying about that.
Yeah. I think I was just saying to Rob, who we both know, Rob Jones, that people, we take all of our experiences with us, to kind of form our worldview or inform our worldview. And yeah, I think, when people read artworks or experience them, they are bringing their own frame of reference and that's ultimately what you can't control.
And I agree. I don't think you can, because even if I present my work to another woman who's had the same type of breast cancer as me, has the same feelings about it, that person still may not interpret my work the way that I do.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's a question of how much time and energy you want to put into trying to make every single person understand, when that's impossible. Yeah, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So going back to your practice and to your journey, can you tell me about non-places within the body? Because I know that that's something you're interested in, and something that we've talked about kind of casually in passing.
Yes, well, I became very interested in the idea of the non-place. And I think it stemmed from the final year of my MA, or the final 18 months, because I was thinking a lot. Okay, I'm going to take a step back now, Oliver, that when I first began the MA, I was looking at the whole body response to breast cancer and the whole emotional response. But I realized I needed to become more objective. I needed to take a step back from it. That's what I felt intuitively, because also that heavy focus on, well, this is me and this is what I went through, started to feel self-indulgent to me.
Yes. Yeah.
Not in a negative way, but just in a way that I felt it wasn't helpful to me, and it wasn't helpful to me in my work moving forward. So I made a conscious decision to begin to step back from my work, and I began looking at ways of stepping back, gaining objectivity, and I made the decision to focus in on the scar, the surgical scar, as a subject. And I made that the subject of my work, and I began experimenting with different media, different ideas, different concepts to think about the scar itself as a subject. And I began thinking about this idea of looking at Julia Kristeva's theory of the abject, and I began to think, okay, well, the inside is the abject. And then I began to look at the outside, everything that's outside of it, as more sublime, and the scar itself, the skin, the scar, as the liminal boundary between the two. And that's where I was at the end of my MA. And the work that I created an 8-channel immersive surround sound installation, which was a mapping out of a photograph of the scar itself into sound. So it was an audio sculpture of the surgical scar.
Yeah, amazing.
And from there, I put in a proposal for the PhD based on that. But once that was in and accepted, I realized I felt like that was done, that idea was done, and it didn't feel enough, and I wasn't excited by it enough. So I just began reading, just thinking about different ideas. I was very interested in the concept of ruins, the concepts of destruction, theories around those, which led me to the idea of the non-place, which is a theory by Marc Auger, where what he suggests is that in the places that we inhabit, there are these kind of neglected spaces, or these spaces that don't have their own real identity. They're places where we exist, but we don't actually live our lives. They don't have an inscription of place. And so that can be waiting rooms, motorways, airport terminals, places we pass through, corridors.
Yeah, sort of like thresholds.
Thresholds, they're liminal spaces.
Yeah.
And that led me to the idea of, well, perhaps then when something is removed from the body, is that a non-place? because particularly for the female breast, I think when that becomes, arguably when it's damaged or something's removed from it, or it's removed in its entirety, its meaning is changed. And I think that there are spaces, external spaces in life, where they can become derelict. Once they're derelict, their meaning is changed. Mm. And that's how I began to form this idea of this interior space becoming analogous with Marc Augé's theory of the non-place.
That's so interesting. I'm thinking about my work, and in my work, things are kind of destruction occurs. There's this kind of collapse of concepts, ideas. A collapse of self is quite kind of really integral to it, and all of those embodied emotions that go with that. But collapse is inherently a productive mechanism. And I wonder, is there a sense of kind of production or repair within your kind of theory of a non-place in the body, or is it more focusing on absence?
Well, that's a good question, because I think that the drive behind it on an intuitive level is to heal.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it is to find a way of healing, but that healing doesn't necessarily mean that anything in and of itself is repaired.
Yeah.
I think.
Interesting. Like, things are kind of, some things are maybe just profoundly changed forever.
Yeah,
perhaps.
And I think that maybe it's more about that. It's investigating what the potential is for change. And also the idea, my interest in the non-place, to an extent, came from my interest in archaeological and architectural ruins. That it's an interest that I've had my whole life, that I realized when I encountered Augé's non-place that actually those external physical architectural non-places are places that have interested me since I was a very young child, when there were still bomb sites in the UK. Even in the 1970s, there were still places where you could see where it had been bombed. In the 1940s. And I think I became intrigued by those places, and the places that people walk past, the places that people other. And I think there's an argument when one becomes very ill or very injured, there can be a real sense of feeling othered.
Yes, yeah.
And I have a very vivid memory of being wheeled from the ward to the surgical suite in the hospital. And I wanted to walk there because I like that feeling of agency.
Yes.
And I knew that I had a lot of adrenaline coursing through my body, and I felt like I needed to move to burn off some of that adrenaline. But I wasn't allowed. I was forced to lay on a trolley and be pushed. And I remember having a sense of being laid flat on this trolley, wanting to connect with people. I wanted a human connection. And usually if I walk down a corridor and I see people, I'll smile at them most of the time. But people wouldn't look at me. Nobody on that journey. And I remember thinking how that was one of the most awful, needful, vulnerable journeys of my life.
Absolutely, yeah.
But there was no one to connect with. And that stayed with me, I think.
I mean, there's... gosh. There are lots of jumping off points that I could kind of reply to that. I think the first one is going back to what you said about kind of the removal of the breast and that the change that occurs. I suppose the perception of that person who's undergone that surgery, the perception of kind of a womanhood changes. I don't know if that's the right kind of word to use, but I mean, breasts are inherently kind of sexualized, really sexualized.
Particularly in Western culture.
Yeah.
Very, very much. And there's a lot of research into that as well. A lot of theorists as well have looked at that idea of the female breast specifically being, in a kind of heteronormative culture, being very linked to femininity.
Yes.
And to the idea of sexuality, of nourishment, of femininity, of womanhood, as you said. And when that becomes damaged, something I've noticed amongst the breast cancer community, for want of a better phrase, is this sense of, well, who am I now? Am I still feminine? Am I still a woman? And certainly women who've had both breasts removed, I've encountered women who very much struggle with that idea of that sense of femininity.
Yeah.
And that meaning. And there are heterosexual women I've met who've said, well, will I still be desirable to a man without my breasts? As if this is... And see, I said earlier that it was important to me to step back from myself as a whole and begin to try and gain some objectivity. And one of the reasons for that was because I realized that when I was looking at my own body, the scar was all I could see. I realized that I was very focused on that, and that's where my eyes went, and there was a lot of crying and a lot of distress around that. And I thought, I was aware that that's almost a kind of dysmorphia to only see myself that way. And the way I managed to step back from it was by agreeing to do some life modeling for a painter, which is something prior to having breast cancer surgery I never did. Ever. So I sat for this painter, and lo and behold, when I saw the finished painting, it wasn't just of a scar, it was of a whole person. And actually the scar itself was barely noticeable, and the damage to the breast was not as noticeable as it was to me.
Yeah.
And obviously for her, that was just one element.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, it was the defining feature at that point. And going through that process of being able to, and I consciously chose to do that with this in mind. I was hoping that it would enable me to step back and see my body the way that another person sees it, in order that I would then be able to step back from the experience and begin to see myself as a whole person.
Yeah. That's an incredibly powerful experience to go through, and obviously really transformative for you. And it makes me think about there's this sort of emerging discipline called neuroarts, which is sort of the confluence of arts and aesthetic studies with neurobiology. And a kind of main argument of this is art has the power to sort of rewire the brain and cause sort of physiological effects. And it kind of sounds like you've had a really salient experience in that, i.e., multiple senses have been engaged, including a kind of conceptual rewiring that has changed your perception of how you see yourself. But I wonder, in that process, has it changed the kind of embodied phenomenological side of things? Did you feel different in your body in the way you carried yourself, or I don't know, because so many within kind of trauma and traumatic experiences, it's so much of what we feel is kind of related to pain. I know in my own experience, a lot of sort of my depression and everything was really embodied as pain and lethargy and anxiety, and I wondered, what for you, How would that be comparable? I struggle to find the right words, really.
Yeah, I agree. It's held in the body.
Yeah.
Absolutely, trauma is held in the body, physically and emotionally. I think that experiences that are very physical experiences, like the ones that you and I both experienced, I do believe that they're not just physical traumas. They are psychological traumas, and I think that they're very whole body. And I think when we go through these things, we become aware also that they are traumas that happen to other people as well. So the people around us and the people who care about us, we learn that actually they have their own trauma around our trauma too. So it's like a collective kind of trauma. So there's a trauma that's interior to us, a psychological trauma, there's the physical trauma, and then there's the external trauma. And I've forgotten your question.
it was about, well, that kind of answers the latter part of it in a really interesting way. And yeah, it's so true, the kind of ripple effect of things that happen to our friends and our family, our loved ones, off the back of our own experience. But my question was kind of, when you had that
rewiring,
and when you had that that life-drawing experience, it kind of changed your perception of yourself, sort of your, in your mind, in your brain. But did that have an effect on your body storing the trauma or any kind of physical?
It did. It did. I certainly, and I'm not really a big believer. I believe in light bulb moments, but I think that the change that comes from those light bulb moments takes time.
Yeah.
And there's an idea, I think, in our culture, and I see it on social media, where it's like, if you're depressed, you just need to do mindfulness and then you'll be fine, which I don't believe it's as simple as a meme.
Yeah.
I think even if that meme makes sense, life is much more complex. And I think our brains are extremely complex. And I think sometimes it can be a massive light bulb moment, but then it needs to trickle down and marinate, and it takes time to change. And the work that I did creatively and on an emotional level after this stepping back, seeing this painting and thinking, okay, so this now it had taken me a lot of work to get to that point. And then from that point onwards, it changed, that work changed, because suddenly it was about this scar. Suddenly it wasn't, I've been through this awful thing and I'm putting it all out there. Suddenly it was something that I felt excited by.
Yeah.
Not the scar itself. If you ask me if I'm glad I went through it, I'm always going to say no, I think. Yeah. It's just shit.
Yes, yeah.
And sometimes in life, things we go through are just shit. I don't think of myself as a warrior or a survivor or a brave person. I'm just a person who went through a trauma. That's not to minimize that trauma. It's not. And the trauma that you went through is extraordinary. It's a huge trauma, and one that will reverberate. How can it not?
It just, yeah.
However, life goes on.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's about what we do with that, isn't it? And how we interpret that and what we can gain from it. I think in terms of rewiring the brain, something I've been looking at recently and thinking a lot about is repetition.
Yeah. Okay.
Because repetition is something that crept into my work very quietly a long time ago. And I was quite upset about it at the time, because I thought maybe my work is getting boring because there's a lot of repetition. And it took me a long time to realize that actually there's a lot of research out there that looks at this idea of almost like Deleuze, kind of the eternal return. that no moment is identical to the next. And even if I write a piece of sound work or a piece of music where I play the same thing over and over again for 20 minutes on the piano, no iteration of that phrase or that idea or that motif is going to be the same. Even if I could play it identically every time, it's happening in a different temporal moment.
Yeah.
And that's what interests me. And part of the reason for that is that when I was doing the trauma work for PTSD, what I learned is that trauma work is incredibly repetitive. And what one does in the particular, I did a form of trauma called prolonged exposure therapy, which was devised by Edna Foer. And the idea of it is, on a very basic level, one goes back, because what can happen in traumatic experiences is that they can become fragmented. The memories become fragmented in the brain.
Right.
And it can become extremely hard for a person with severe trauma or PTSD to be able to tell the story of what happened to them in chronological order, in detail. It will tend to come in fragments or flashbacks. And this is part of what I think is very disorienting about trauma, because we can lose the narrative, but our bodies are still feeling it.
Yes.
And prolonged exposure therapy works on the idea that when we're living our lives generally, we're processing what we're going through all the time. So the conversation we're having today, we're processing it right now. And later on this evening, hopefully I'll have a bit of quiet time and my brain will continue to process it. When we are exposed to an extremely traumatic experience, we go into fight or flight, or freeze, or fawn mode. And in those moments, our brains are not processing in the same way. So that processing needs to happen later. And if it doesn't happen adequately, this fragmentation can happen and PTSD can develop. And I can't remember the psychologist who said it's in the absence of an empathic witness that PTSD can develop. So if we don't have a person that we can communicate with who reflects back to us the seriousness of what we've been through, we're more vulnerable to developing long-term sort of issues around trauma.
That makes me think of, I'm really interested in kind of relational ontologies, which is sort of ontology is the kind of how things exist in the world, relational being, relations between people, objects, ideas, all of it. That's the kind of the sort of theoretical version, perhaps, of, I think it's so important, just as a person, to be plugged into a sense of community. And I think when you are experiencing some form of real sort of emotional turmoil, you tend to have this break from reality and this disconnect from a social circle or those things, like going into work or, I don't know, school or whatever, that the social aspect of living that keeps you grounded. And
as part of prolonged exposure therapy, what one does is goes back into the original trauma that triggered the PTSD, and one relates it to the therapist, but also records it.
Right.
So it becomes an audio recording, and what will happen is the client will be encouraged to then repeat that story over and over again for a set amount of time, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then between sessions, you take that recording home and listen to it. And that act of hearing oneself, talking about it gradually, with the repetition, what happens is the original memory begins to emerge and the chronology of it begins to fall back into place and the detail re-emerges, because often what will happen when people are traumatized is we'll try and push things away.
Yeah.
And that means things become lost. And then with flashbacks and emotional responses to trauma, it can become more and more confusing and more anxiety inducing. And so with this repetition, every day, over and over again, the next week, go through it again with the therapist, take those recordings home, listen to them again and again and again, stay in that moment, in that experience. What one begins to understand is the brain begins to process that memory through repetition, but it also begins to understand that actually that traumatic experience is over now, and it's not happening now. And it updates the brain. And so there is a neurological rewiring to the act of repetition. And I think what artists do very, very well is repetition.
Yeah.
I think we develop an idea and we think a lot about that idea and we explore that idea, and we oftentimes make the same piece of work repeatedly, albeit in different ways. That we'll say, right, I'm going to take a photograph, but then maybe we'll take 50 photographs.
Yes. Yeah.
Or like myself, I'm going to photograph this scar every single day. Or in the sound works that I make, I'm quite interested in repetition right now, and I couldn't really understand why, but when I began thinking about it from the perspective of the way that repetition within trauma therapy rewires the brain, there's also suggestion that, repetition within creativity, within processes, can also help us to rewire the brain.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of sort of stepping aside from the neurological side of things. It really makes me think about body without organs, which is the Deleuze and Guattari theory of kind of, I think I see it as with any Deleuze and Guattarian sort of theory, there's different ways of approaching it, as sort of the very nature of how they write. But I see it as about reconfiguration and sort of dismantling. And I think it's almost a condition of the artist to sort of, maybe through repetition, is to really think about the core, the meat of the artwork, and to repeat it with differences that make the work stronger and the work more effective. And so what they say about the body without organs is to sort of empty the body of organs of sort of preconceived, idealized function, so you can analyze them from an objective point of view. You can look at the real, the factual meanings of these parts in order to rebuild a whole that works to produce a greater effect than before, which really kind of speaks to your idea of repetition and production. And it's really interesting to hear that plugged into trauma and personal experience as well. I recently said to somebody, sometimes the only way out is through. We were talking about kind of something else entirely, but that seems to be quite apt now.
I think it is. I think there are just some moments in life, and there are some experiences which make no sense.
Yeah.
And I think in life there are senseless experiences. And I think there are people who try and frame it in different ways as, well, I went through this trauma and it made me who I am, or I wouldn't be who I am without the trauma. And I've always looked at that and thought, well, it's just left me a traumatized person, and I would rather just not be a traumatized person.
Yeah.
I would still be me.
Yeah.
But me without trauma, which I quite like the idea of. So I agree that I think there are just some experiences, and this is where my interest in the non-place also began to develop further, in the idea of thinking of waiting, the idea of waiting, of time itself, the idea that it can become a temporal non-place.
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering if you can relate to this and whether you experienced this, that you spent a lot of time in hospital. And there's something about time in hospital where it doesn't feel like a real time. It's a waiting time, even when one is healing in hospital. And what I found with my own cancer experience is that there was a lot of waiting. That when one has a biopsy, the results are not apparent immediately. One has to wait for the results. And then when one has the results of the biopsy, what one is told is, this is what the biopsy shows, this is what we think it is, but it may not only be this. And then becomes the next period of waiting for the surgery, waiting for results. And what I noticed in that waiting period, all those waiting periods, was it felt like a different kind of waiting to when I'm waiting for the bus or waiting to start this podcast earlier, which was quite a nice kind of waiting. It just felt like a bit of downtime on a day when I'm tired. And sometimes I'm waiting for things, I feel a bit irritable, but I don't really mind. But waiting in that medical context, that was a different kind of waiting. It felt endless. It felt uncomfortable. It felt frightening. It felt hollow. And I didn't know when it was going to end. There was just no release from it. And it felt like a waiting where I didn't feel like I could get on with my life.
Yes.
And that is the type of... So I began to label that now as a non-place, a temporal non-place, that particular type of waiting that is incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, I really, really resonate with what you're saying. I spent a long time in hospital too, and had surgeries, waiting for test results. I think it's all... Definitely, it becomes... Time doesn't abide by the same rules in those spaces. There's a bit of physics behind my current practice because I'm sort of bastardizing black holes and theory behind them. And, with black holes, there's such extreme distortions of space-time. And it is that. It is... I don't know if it's potentially a kind of psychological... to do with a psychological break from reality of sorts, but it's interesting. I do think that for me, when I had very severe poor mental health, that time just wasn't so much paused as it was in hospital, because that is certainly feels like a pause of real life. But time just becomes this kind of strange, lucid, sort of two-dimensional concept that's almost... It just becomes an idea, and it's not something that you live within, but that you're almost observing. I think arguably poor mental health is sort of quite severe dissociation. But it's that... the physics of time changing is very interesting. I think the temporal non-place of waiting is something that I reckon a lot of people have experienced in some form, in some way. And whether that's related to kind of a non-place within the body or another kind of sort of maybe traumatic experience. Or something else entirely.
Or, as you said, or mental health issues.
Yeah.
Because I agree with that too. I think I hadn't thought of it that way until it's interesting that you brought that up. But yes, that experience of disconnection and dissociation within poor mental health or it is very much time is very distorted within those places.
So
and having been in a situation where I've experienced a full dissociative episodes of just having no awareness of the passage of time whatsoever, or where I am or what I'm doing, just feeling disconnected to the extent that not even connected to my physical body as well. It's a very extreme place to be in, but it's also a very clever space that our brains put us into, I think, sometimes to help us survive.
Yes. Yeah. I can really see that as a safety response, sort of emergency, kind of last resort type of coping mechanism maybe isn't the right word, but yeah, definitely.
I'm really interested what you were saying about black holes too, that kind of idea that I think that temporal non-place of waiting almost feels like being trapped in the event horizon of a black hole. I thought that was a really nice analogy.
Yeah,
I like that a lot.
Thank you. That's when you go, as you journey through the black hole into the singularity, which is at the center. It's not just time that distorts, but it's you, and you spaghettify, and you end up being pulled by gravity apart, right down to like the smallest, smaller than atoms, like Planck lengths of particles, which are kind of, I don't have the data, the facts with me, but they are incomprehensibly small. They are so small, the smallest measurement that we have that exists. But black holes are kind of the ultimate dilation of time, and the singularity is infinite crushing of matter, because of its such gravity. It concentrated in that space to the extent that it becomes an event in the future perpetually. So it is not a destination. It's not like, the moon that we can land on. It's just the ether. It's
really interesting, isn't it? And the research I was doing last summer on quantum entanglement, it's such a big topic. My poor brain felt like it was bleeding. It was trying to just follow it. But that idea of this perception of time, it's something I need to dig into more. Particularly because I've got to write a proposal by the end of the month. Yeah.
This has been a bonkers episode.
Has it? Has it been bonkers?
It's been bonkers.
Oh, that's interesting. Why is that?
I feel like...
Because I came in unprepared, and because I thought, let's do it intuitively.
I think I'm all for intuition. It's just that bit in the afternoon where kind of my brain goes to sleep. And then it wakes up again at like sort of 6 p.m. And I have another sort of, productive peak. Yeah, second wind. Yeah, but you've been great. And as I said in the intro, you've just got such a natural integrity to you that is just switched on and cogent and just really, really fascinating. And I know that there's going to be listeners out there who will just find what you've gone through really resonant and impactful and insightful. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the compliment too.
Great, yeah. Where can people find you on the internet?
Okay. Sirenwire.com.
Sirenwire.
Or on Instagram at Sirenwire.
Great. And that's Siren and then Wire.
Siren Wire.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you, listeners, for listening. You can find me on Instagram at Ollie Kirkham, and I will be posting about art and such as, and you can email me armchairartistpod@gmail.com, armchairartistpod@gmail.com. See the descriptions for links and any kind of resources that we touch upon, I'm sure I will hopefully remember to put them in the comments. It's just goodbye now, isn't it? Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.